Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I'd like to thank my co-panel members, and in particular the previous speaker, Mr. Gautam. He's kind of set the scene for my presentation, for which I thank him very much indeed. And I would like to introduce to you a little bit of a different concept that I think, in my opinion, fits very nicely with the Indian scene. So I hope that it creates a reasonable amount of interest. But first of all, I'd like to just say I'm very grateful to the organizers of this Congress, particularly Dr. Anil Garg, for inviting me. Love coming to India, and I haven't been for quite a long time, so I'm looking forward to catching up with a few good friends while I'm here. And I'm also very proud to have received the honor yesterday in recognition of the work that I've done in coal, which I've been involved with since I left school in 1960, so it's very much a part of my life. My paper is about creating value from a coal delivery chain, and I'd like you to think in terms of what needs to be done in order to deal with some of the problems that Mr. Gautam's just highlighted here in India. So I'd just like you to reflect on a few what I call focusing questions, and we've almost answered the first one. How long will coal be needed? A long time. 2 decades seem to be the consensus from the talks that people gave yesterday, and here in India, probably a lot longer. And in getting to where we need to be, I would like to offer you the concept of optimization, but I'd like you to think of it in terms of the complete supply chain. And rather than be pushed to the end of the supply chain, face all the problems and consequences there, I'd like you to start to take a journey with me and go back to the very beginning, where we start to prospect for a coal deposit with a view to its eventual end use, and look at it in a little bit of a different way. So we'll start by looking at the situation as it is at the moment, and then have a look at what the options might be in the future. So what directions can or should optimization take? And then my story, my theme, if you like, is coal beneficiation. You know, that is essentially concentrating carbon into its most useful form for the end user. Without going through this, I think it encapsulates all the comments from yesterday's presentations about the future of coal, and I don't need to convince you, I don't think, after that coal is alive and well in India, but needs a lot doing to it, and it has a very bad image. So these I guess, topics cover all of the aspects that a lot of the presentations yesterday covered. And without going into too much detail, coal's role as a fuel is facing more scrutiny than at any time in the past. And in certain parts of the world, the United States, for example, it's almost agonizing to see the extent that coal is being viewed as something they would prefer not to have and not to be dependent on. Whereas in India, I believe it's quite the opposite, and there's a pragmatic view towards using coal more effectively in the future. These are a couple of slides that I borrowed from a friend of mine in Wood Mackenzie that show, that confirm what we've just said. There's plenty of opportunity for coal to continue to grow. It's very regional, and the growth areas there, we talked about them yesterday. China and India predominate, but I think there's plenty of opportunity in Africa as well, and not to forget that they too have a very large population that are deprived of electricity and the basic quality of life, but they also have quite decent coal resources to draw from in the future. And then, of course, the coal deposits in Southeast Asia, and growing interest in using them more effectively. So just to remind you that the planning process behind developing a coal resource has to be very rigorous. And there was a very good presentation yesterday that featured on the amount of work that you need to do in what's called the front-end loading assessment of a coal resource. There are no shortcuts. You have to look at it in terms of what is in the ground, what you need for the supply chain that you're feeding to, and then how you go about getting the information that you need. So if you can imagine it, the diagram on the left-hand side in this slide just gives you a very sort of simplistic view of the supply-demand concept. You know, there's coal in the ground, that coal has to reach a stage in terms of its assessment and evaluation that you know when you mine it that you're going to deliver it into a supply chain with no shocks. And things like the JORC code and other codes that are used around the world build a rigor, not just for investors, but into the conscience of people that are involved in the supply chain, that they have cut out, they've eliminated much of the unknown that they need to have assessed before they begin to provide coal into the supply chain. And with changes, Andrew mentioned his paper there, you know, that what is it that's different now that we need to know from the resource, a stranded resource, which is a very, very large entity probably. What is it that we really need to know before we dig a hole in it? And how do we go about collecting that information and then accumulating it through the process of conceptual study, pre-feasibilities, feasibilities, design, procurement, construction, production? What is it we need to accumulate in terms of knowledge in order for the whole supply chain to be a success? And these are some of the things. This diagram is just meant to make you think about what you need to know and then ask the question, is that what we're really doing? Or are we taking some kind of a shortcut? Or are we listening to commercial people that say, I'm sorry, but that would be far too expensive, and therefore we can't go ahead and sanction that kind of funding. So nothing happens. So you take a shorter cut, and you end up with the wrong outcome. You end up with a very unprofitable project. Just to put things into perspective, some of you may have seen this before. I've used it for many years. Beneficiation in the coal preparation plant doesn't really do a lot in terms of providing you with the knowledge that you need. It only does the things at the tip of that pyramid. And then below it, you can accumulate some more knowledge through the course of your operation, and maybe before that from feasibility studies. The real information that you need, and more complex the outcome in terms of the end user, the more difficult it is to get, is the information at the bottom of the pyramid. And getting that is usually more difficult, more expensive, especially to get something which is representative. So this is where, in terms of front-end loading, developing a new project, or understanding a resource, this is where it gets expensive. Let's look at it in terms of the whole supply chain. Now we've started with developing a resource, we're starting to understand it. It has to go through all these processes in order to end up in terms of the user. So in my case, I live in a country in Australia where most of our coal is prepared for markets that aren't in Australia. So we have essentially all the things in the red boxes. That is where our process is taken through to the stage where coal is delivered at the right quality for the end user. And then when the end user gets it, the items in the yellow boxes there, they're the functions that take place. And the coal quality information, which is collected at the very beginning, before the truck is loaded, has an impact on the whole process in the yellow boxes. So how have you collected the information that allows the user to really be able to assess how your coal is going to behave when he puts it into his blast furnace, or when he starts to make steel in the basic oxygen furnace, or he starts to make steel products? Have you provided the information that is required? And that is something that is clouded to some extent by the sequence of operations in terms of the marketing area. There are people in the marketing area that, let's say, will try to provide information that creates value in use, but avoid giving information that devalues the product in the market. Just to sort of look at the whole process, We can look at any element within the supply chain, and we can optimize within that. But unless we start to look at the whole chain, the value of optimization in any one area may not really be a positive contribution to the whole supply chain. And also time is a factor. So what is being produced now that is a component of a product at some stage later on may not comply with the specification that you're trying to provide for the user. So you need to take all these things into account. And if you're going to start to look at how to forecast that, then the model that you create that deals with the whole supply chain has to have that knowledge base built into it and accessible. Otherwise, it will give you the wrong answer. And there are tools available, and they're widely used. And the thing to remember is that they're only as good as the information that you put in. So you always get an answer, which is always a problem with an Excel spreadsheet. It gives you a very good answer, seems very complicated. The question you have to ask yourself is it giving me the right answer? Can I believe that? And if I go back and look at where the knowledge came from, only then would I have confidence perhaps in the answer I get. So a model that I build that tells me how an outcome from a mining operation will result, or a piece of software that tells me how my coal preparation plant will function and what outcome I can expect from it, a model that spans from the pit to the port. And then models of the users as well. Power plant models, there are a number of them. EPRI has one called Vista. There are blast furnace and coke plant, and there are steelworks models, all used to provide some indication, a forecast of how things might turn out in terms of the various operations. So when you're looking at information across a whole supply chain, it only really is likely to give you the answers that you need if there's a lot of cooperation for the individual elements or silos that are composed in the supply chain. And it was a bit of interesting yesterday. Mr. Prakash from Adani gave a very good indication of how you deal with something like that. You have to have the resource, you have to have the facilities to process, you have to have the logistics, you have to have the power station or the steelworks, and then you can accumulate the information that you need to give you a good indication of what you are likely to get. And that's probably a very positive way forward. It's doable in other circumstances where there is a lot of interaction and confidence between a supplier and a user, but often some missing costs. And cost is a vital element of the knowledge base. Some basic costs are not available, and they create some doubt in terms of the outcome. Just to give you some idea, to what extent is it required to clean a coal? I think the previous presentation highlighted that in India, the established way was to minimize the amount of beneficiation, coal cleaning that carries on, that is carried out in the early stages of the supply chain, and let the power station do most of the work itself. Not fair, because if you're taking a very high ash material all the way through the supply chain and you're giving it to an end user and saying, grind that down, put it in your power plant and do your best, there's a better solution than that. And I think if you approach it in the way that I've described, then these elements of different levels of coal cleaning, if you start to look at them as cost entities all the way along the supply chain, what do you end up with in a power boiler when you're ready to burn it? Pulverized coal, highly liberated, but containing a lot of the original mineral matter and not a very high concentration of carbon. So what happens if you were to do that whole process earlier on in the supply chain? Would it cost more? Would it be more difficult? How do you transport it from the mine to the power plant? There are solutions to all these things. The thing is that you have to look at them in terms of how you might optimize and what is the best cost route. Cost is key. This is a friend of mine who worked for what used to be called Eon Technologies, now called Uniper Technologies. he uses a model which was developed jointly by E.ON, which is based to some extent on EPRI's Vista. And what I like about this is it turns costs for each of the individual components into a cost in terms of dollars per ton or a cost in terms of cents per kilowatt hour. So you're presenting costs from the very beginning of the supply chain in the terms of the user, and also identifying them in terms of cost. Now, those numbers might not mean very much if you have no confidence in them. And these are, I must say, some of the costs that I contributed towards the first stages in the red boxes, in this case, were based on some actual cases that we were looking at the time. And some of the I tried to get these more up to date, but that is a reasonable perspective. And look at that, and when you do start to study it, you realize that if you go back to the mining stage and you can create a major improvement there, it has a huge impact all the way along the supply chain. Huge. And when you break that down into, well, what are the costs that are incurred within the power plant, these headings will give you some idea. So the original number that we looked at, which was between 1 and 2 cents per kilowatt hour, is subdivided into those groups. And things like the preparation of the fuel at the beginning, milling, and a good example in India, will be a very high part of the cost to the user. So that if mining improvement, by removing a lot of the stone that finds its way all the way along the supply chain, if that is dealt with, the benefits are very clearly defined in terms of what you'd see in terms of the cost of operating the boiler and performance of the boiler. This software has a whole variety of different ways of interpreting it, including the benefit of improved CO2. And I think that is something you can build in. There are more than one of these models, and I'm sure that someone has access to them in India. But they tell you a lot, and they ask the question, how reliable are the numbers that you've used, and how much can I depend on the results as the answer? I just wanted to very quickly just give you a couple of case studies. One is a raw coal one, since I just mentioned that. Here's a case where the convention is truck and shovel, and in Australia it might be truck and shovel and drag line. Very conventional. It's gone towards big shovels, big trucks, very high capacity, high capital cost, and lower operating cost. But there are other ways of doing that. And also, there's no beneficiation in the pit. None. Essentially, what's mined, in many cases, is bulk mined, goes all the way to the washing plant, and in some cases might even go all the way to the power station. In this case, just to compare, the two options are to use a truck and shovel or to use something called in-pit crushing and conveying. And these numbers, without going into any detail, clearly show that in terms of capital cost, you have to pay a lot of money to put in-pit crushing and conveying into a pit. Whereas truck and shovel is a very familiar cost, and the equipment, economies of scale apply, and generally matching the equipment gives you the best outcomes. But when you look at those in terms of ongoing cost, once that's installed, it beats the alternative hands down as long as it's applicable. And in that, and I noticed in the previous presentation, India is looking at surface mining equipment, things like Vertgen. That means you can actually do selective mining. You can beneficiate from the outcome in the pit. You might even be able to put dry cleaning unit inside the pit and send some of the material back. In which case, the whole analysis of what you're doing within the pit area starts to look very much more favorable. So there's a lot of opportunity there to really address that very high upfront cost that has such an impact on the power plant. But there are other solutions as well, and the other one I've looked at that we'll also have a quick look at a case study is to look at coal supply chains involving coal water slurries. It seems that maybe that is a very big extreme and a major step change, because create a slurry, do the beneficiation before the coal goes into the pipeline, let's say, or goes into some sort of transport logistics system, would seem to be a very big change from what we do as convention. But when you look at it, and particularly in terms of some of the aspects that Andrew Minchin presented in terms of clean coal technology really being applied into coal conversion, this could very well be an answer, something that we could do in the very near future. And it's an economics decision because the technology is already in place. We could do this now. It was done 25 years ago. It can be done a lot more efficiently now. And this is the sort of message that we should look at. So my case study really is to look at, in Australia, we waste 10 to 15 million tons of coal a year because it seems to be uneconomical to recover anything minus 50 microns. 50 microns, perfect feed for a power plant. So if we can recover that, we have made a big contribution, a big impact from the very beginning. And the idea is that we have to then think about how we would get the coal from where we've made the slurry to the end user, and in what form the end user would want to apply it. The end user could actually use available heat on site, cost effectively, to convert it back into pulverized fuel and use it as a conventional fuel at very, very low levels of ash relative to what they normally use. Maybe less than, well, single-digit ash and maybe down to as low as 3 or 4%. For a bituminous coal, that's a pretty powerful mix. But then they may also, because technology is available and used in China, for example, just fire it as a slurry and get the benefits that way. So there are a number of ways that you can look at that. If we look at it in terms of the same supply chain that we looked at before, obviously this is different now. We have very little mining cost up front because this stuff is going to be disposed of as a tailings. We've got a little bit more additional cost in processing, crushing it, milling it down, and predominance of fine coal cleaning then. So we're looking at froth flotation or flotation technologies as a way of creating the concentrated carbon that we require. And then we've got to look at maybe utilizing the supply system that's now used for fuel oil or liquid fuels, transporting it through the whole supply system via a vessel and into a user's port, and then converting it back into whatever fuel form that you want. And the E.ON assessment of that, with a number of assumptions, and these are not great numbers, but they're not bad numbers, show that it is actually cost-effective to look at that as a supply chain. Technically viable, commercially in question, so it needs some more thinking, but it is a viable option for delivering a carbon-rich fuel into a power plant. Or perhaps it's going to be used in a coal conversion plant, and will be supplied at a very comparative cost. There's already a lot of work being done in the United States initially, and in Australia more recently, and with European cooperation on something called micronized coal water fuel, which essentially is a stabilized slurry fuel with about 60% solids, chemically stabilized with very low ash, perhaps 1% ash content, that is fired directly using a modified injection system into a diesel engine. And the benefits of that are obvious, and it can be used in quite remote places as long as there's a supply chain, a delivery chain that's put in place to make it happen. So that's something for you to think about, and I think the younger element of people in this group are the ones who are going to have to implement these kind of changes. So I hope that that's giving you some food for thought. We know that you've got plenty of time because nobody's going to stop using coal any time soon. So in the next couple of decades, you have to make something like this happen. Otherwise, we're in big trouble. We can't go on doing what we're doing now. We have to make radical changes to how we use coal in the future. And we know that if we adopt a process of supply chain optimization, the value is there to justify doing it. But there are no shortcuts in getting the information that we need at the beginning to give credibility to the solution that we're aiming to achieve. A lot of coal producers, supplier companies, and people in the coal trading business have seen the value in using coal supply chain models like the pit-to-port one, and they're becoming increasingly widely used. It gives a supplier a bit more of a case to make to the user in terms of the value in use or cost in use of the coal that they're going to supply. And since fuel is the largest cost component in the power generation part of the chain, the incentive is that the more efficient the power plant is, or the more efficient the user plant is, the better the outcome. So there's a great incentive to work towards the same goal. User doesn't want to spend as much money as they are now in using your coal, and you want to provide them with a fuel that they will pay a fair price for. I think there's a step change towards this kind of optimized energy solution in the wind. It is commercially viable. I think the age of rocks in the bulk carrier, crushed coal minus 50 millimeter, it has to change soon. That's not the best way of delivering the coal that users will need into the market for whatever use they want to put it to. And we have the responsibility to improve what is really a very poor image for coal at the present time in the next decade or so. So I hope that's been interesting, and be very happy to have any comments, answer questions as best I can. But thank you again for coming to this presentation.